And then you quote this adage that is so powerful, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. I don't know if everyone has heard that before. Can you unpack that? What does that mean? And then I'm curious if you think it's true.
That phrase is common, as it turns out, to cultures around the world throughout history. There are versions or variations of that same expression in China and in the Netherlands and in other places, because there's just something about human nature that there's a success cycle that tends to run such that you have someone who's industrious and hardworking and invents or creates something that generates wealth. That person becomes wealthy in the process. And then there's another generation behind that's given the choice about what to do. How do you steward that resource or those resources in a way, using the other examples, along the lines of the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers? How do you steward those resources in a way that are beneficial to the family, but also to others outside the family? And the pattern, about 90% of the time, according to data, is that by the end of the 3rd generation, wealth failure will happen.
Hello, and welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast, a show about learning to love generously like Jesus. I'm your host, Brian Grosso. Today on the show, I talk with a wealth manager who likes to have conversations with his clients about giving. Chris Gabriel describes himself as a philosopher financial advisor, highlighting that the word philosopher means lover of wisdom. And in this conversation, we talk a lot about wisdom and generosity and what they have to do with each other. Chris has written a book on this topic, a book called Wise Generosity, and he has years of experience as a wealth manager. We talk about the difference between wealth success and wealth failure and what factors lead to wealth success versus failure in multi-generational families. We talk about how morality is critical for the functioning of democracy and free markets. And we talk about whether wealth managers can or should encourage their clients to radical generosity. Join me for a conversation about wealth, wisdom, and giving. If you are listening to this podcast, this is your show. Thank you so much for being here. As always, send me any thoughts or questions you have at brian@simplecharity.org. And if the show is helpful to you, please help us out by clicking a 5-star rating in your podcast app, and also click subscribe, whether you're on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. These little actions do a lot to help the algorithm get the show out to more listeners. So thank you for helping out our show. I'm so glad you're with us today.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I serve as a Simple Charity philanthropic advisor to individuals, couples, families, foundations, and family offices in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina, but also to clients around the country. If you're curious about your own generosity journey and would like help thinking through a philanthropic strategy with intentionality to discern where God is calling you to love people, to find excellent nonprofits to partner with, or to understand the impact of your current grant making, I would love to connect and share more about Simple Charity's philanthropic advising offerings. You can connect with me at melissahall@simplecharity.org. That's Melissa Hall at simplecharity.org. And you can learn more about us at simplecharity.org. That's simplecharity.org.
Hi, Chris. Welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Such a pleasure to be here.
Chris, what are you grateful for today?
I am grateful for family today, Brian. In a season of life as a new empty nester, 2 kids in college and older parents who have some health issues, and just really thankful that we're all able to be connected and be part of each other's challenges and opportunities. There's a lot of things going on in that whole web of relationships, and just feeling especially grateful for that.
Do you have a family nearby in the Atlanta area?
We do not. I am a native of the Northeast, and met and married a Southern girl who announced as we were dating that she was going to be moving back to this region. I was welcome to come along Otherwise, it was nice knowing me. And so we ended up getting married and moving here in 1998. So it's been a good long time, and certainly spent far longer in Atlanta than in any other place. But families in the Northeast on my side, and in Western North Carolina on her side.
Hmm. Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation, Chris. We just got connected, a few months ago, and got coffee together, and getting to know you, reading your book, Wise Generosity, that we're going to talk about today, but also just getting to know your passion for taking this message of generosity and bringing it into the financial advisor, wealth advisor space. You have years of experience in that space. So we're going to talk a lot about Wise Generosity today, what it is, what we can learn from you and from your frameworks. This is a book full of helpful frameworks for understanding generosity. I think when we met, you said you always felt this call to be a teacher. And you get that sense in reading this book that you are a teacher on these matters. But before we get into the content, can you give us a quick overview of your story and your career journey, and then what led you to want to write this book on wise generosity?
That's a great question. The short version is I found myself with an unusual career, and that's philosopher, financial advisor. That sounds kind of fancy, but philosopher really means lover of wisdom. And I think in our world of artificial intelligence, where everything's about efficiency and speed and doing more faster, we both as believers and just observers of the outside world run the risk of not focusing in on the things that are really fundamental to have a happy, healthy, successful life, things that we find in Scripture. And I think the ancients did a better job of this than we do. They prized wisdom more than anything else, which is in essence the intersection of values and experience. What do you believe, and then how do you apply that in ways that matter? And so my own journey is somewhat along those lines. I started my career as a nonprofit fundraiser, ended up as a wealth manager somewhat by accident, and along the way was asking some big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Part of my faith journey. Wanting to, having a sense that I was supposed to be serving a calling and a purpose in God's kingdom, and knowing that there were these four pillars in my life: my faith, my family and friends, my professional work, and my community service. And they weren't as aligned or intentionally connected as I wanted them to be. And so in that process of reflection, and being someone who's always been interested in teaching and writing, was a eureka moment at one point, which I actually talk about in the introduction. There was a point in time where God essentially said, I'd like you to be a missionary for generosity. And that's what started this generosity journey. It's about 15 years ago that eventually led to the book. And then Wise Generosity, in turn, is transitioning into being a practical platform for helping people to experience more and better generosity in their lives as a way both to more fully experience Christian discipleship and to emulate Jesus, and also as a practitioner to have tools and resources that make them better at giving. So that's really a lot of what the whole framework and all the other things that you referenced are about, and hopefully wrapped with some really interesting stories that are inspiring. But the whole platform is meant to be a bridge between inspiration and application, and really to encourage people, as you do, to be more meaningfully and effectively generous. So that's certainly something I admire, Brian, about your work and what you do at Simple Charity.
Yeah, I love the language, Chris, of a missionary for generosity. And it's cool to see 15 years of wrestling with what that means turn into this book and turn into this platform that you've built and are continuing to grow. Section 1 of the book, part 2, I think gives us a good place to start this conversation around generosity, wise generosity. Section 1, part 2 is called Why You Should Be Generous. And so I want to start this conversation just by asking, why should I be generous?
Yeah. So one of my underlying assumptions, which I think will resonate with you and your listeners, our audience that's with us today, is that generosity is an essential virtue of a life well lived. That's one of my fundamental beliefs. That's not unique to Christians. You look at pretty much any world philosophy or sort of underlying wisdom tradition, there are elements of generosity built into that. But in our Christian world, it's even more central. We believe that God is generous. Not only is he generous, he so loved the world that he gave his only son. We believe that Jesus was a perfect example of generosity. And one of the most simple and powerful ways to understand discipleship is through the lens of generosity. And so for us as believers, there's a why element that's just sort of built into the fabric of what we're hoping to become in being more like Jesus. But the book, as you know, was written not just for an audience of believers, but also for the wider world. Because that was actually a realization that came on pretty quickly. That first missionary for generosity moment, I was thinking, wow, generosity really is such an amazing way of helping people understand the essence of what it really means to follow Jesus and to be like Jesus. And then thinking about it literally a few more days, I was like, no, actually, that's true. But the people who need this message at least as much are everyone else. Who feel this calling inside of them to be generous, but aren't sure why and don't really have a grounding or basis for following up on it or living into it in the way that we do as believers. And what an opportunity it was, in essence, to share a very accessible version of the gospel message through giving. And so that chapter in the book that you talk about is all about purpose, and basically says there's 4 potential life purposes. Which is really an amazingly hubristic thing to do, is distill all of theology and philosophy down to 4 categories. So
that's a very management consultant things to do.
Yeah, I can't help myself. It's the way my brain works. But I do apologize to all theologians and philosophers for doing something so almost absurd. But if you were to look at those 4, the first is futility, which there's no meaning or purpose to anything, right? That's the nihilistic worldview. But then the other 3, there's a place for generosity in all of those. And you find folks who, whether they are consciously aware or not, are pursuing one of those life purposes. And they are happiness, enlightenment, and fulfillment. Fulfillment, in essence, is a proxy for a Judeo-Christian worldview. Happiness, of course, is is essentially materialist. We're here. It may not mean anything, but let's enjoy it while we're here. The Enlightenment worldview, I'm thinking more of an Eastern mindset, more of a Buddhist philosophy, where life is difficult, and the best way to approach it is to unburden ourselves of things that weigh us down. But fulfillment believes, in contrast, that like Christ, like the other great examples of our forebearers in faith, it's sometimes our job to take things on, to do things that are difficult, to sacrifice in order to help other people. And that's the nature of God, and it's certainly the nature of a faithful witness to God. So generosity kind of gets at all those different elements in different ways. But again, there's some deepness and richness to that introduce people into topics that they otherwise might not think about, but can find accessible because everyone has experience with giving in one form or fashion.
Yeah, I think your perspective on this is fascinating to me as a wealth manager, as someone who helps people create, a financial plan, manage their assets, to think about using wealth in the good life. I think there has been something of a transition in the financial advising industry away from just, hey, we're going to help you manage or grow your assets, towards some of these deeper conversations. I'm curious, feel free to disagree with me on this. I'm not a financial advisor, but it seems like there's this kind of soft skills of, hey, we're going to come alongside you and help you use wealth to live a good life. That seems like a lot of financial advising is going that way, because these are people who you hire who get kind of in the weeds with you and help you understand your money. And you have a whole chapter on wealth success versus wealth failure. And in that chapter, you define wealth success as thriving relationships and productive resources sustained through generations. Unpack that definition for us and help us understand, because this is like a wonderfully paradoxical and unexpected claim that generosity is going to help us use wealth well. So giving wealth away is actually a key to having wealth success, is what you're saying. And there's something so, I don't want to miss the kind of drama of that claim. Like, that is not an intuitive claim, Chris. So what do you mean by that? And unpack what you mean by wealth success.
That's a great question, Brian. The idea of wealth success comes about from experience and observation, and just having a sense of human nature and what our challenges and opportunities are when it comes to money alongside other things. So, as you know from Wise Generosity, the framework is certainly money is area of focus in my professional life. But in terms of generosity, there's actually 5 types offered in the Wise Generosity book. Only the first of which involves money. It's possessional generosity. It's money and stuff. But above that, we've got personal generosity, which is time and talent, and social generosity, which is everything from hospitality and manners to things that are more involved, like civic duty. And then emotional generosity, getting close to home, being vulnerable and accessible to others. And ultimately, the apex, where all of those things lead, is to relational generosity. And again, if you model the behavior of our Lord, that's what he cared about the most, were relationships, the people around him, and their health and their wellness and their welfare, spiritually as well as practically. And how do we do everything in our power to help nurture and support others? And so you're right to point out that the wealth management space has really evolved in that direction, step by step, around goals and then plans, and now getting into things that really are more existential, more integral to who we are as people. I think the better practitioners in the space naturally find themselves having those kinds of conversations and are comfortable doing so. And frankly, there are a lot of others who aren't comfortable with that are just, whoa, I just handle money. I'm not get into your business. One of my roles, as I see it, is to be an advocate within the profession, but particularly the wealth management profession, but even the professional advisory world more broadly, attorneys and accountants and others who interact with clients in ways that intersect what actually matters to them and their lives. And certainly money intersects with all parts of our lives. And so it's an area where these sorts of things can, or at least should, come up in conversation. And generosity being a key and essential part of that is somewhat counter cultural, to say the least. But I think it's also essential for really understanding the nature of wealth and how it successfully passes along. So in that particular chapter that you reference, I actually lay out a story or a contrast between 2 different families whose names are well known, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, who happen to be the 2 wealthiest families this country has ever produced. And yet those families had very different trajectories. I would suggest that the Rockefellers were successful with their wealth and the Vanderbilts were not. And defining success the way you did in terms of relationships and in terms of resources, the Rockefellers were intact as a family across generations to the 3rd and 4th and 5th generation and beyond. And the Vanderbilts hated each other and had completely split apart by the 2nd or 3rd generation. Likewise, the Vanderbilt name these days is primarily known for Gilded Age excess and houses that are museums that no one, at least no one in the family, can afford to live in. And the Rockefellers are still synonymous with being rich. And the aspect of generosity underlying that was both internal and external. So the Rockefellers were generous to each other. They cared about the subsequent generations. They invested in nurturing and developing them in thoughtful ways. Each generation looked to the next as an opportunity to continue on doing the good work that the family had felt called to. And likewise, in terms of money, they didn't just lavishly spend on themselves. They set up the first significant corporate philanthropy through the Rockefeller Foundation. They bought vast amounts of land in America and donated it to what are now some of our most beautiful national parks, from Maine to Hawaii. and did many other things that deliberately used resources in a way that were productive and beneficial to others. And it's sort of that animating spirit, I think, that helped them be successful. So there's just something about that. And of course, if we look spiritually, and we look at the Bible, for example, these are age-old human behaviors. And you don't have to look farther than Scripture to see examples of similar patterns developing. And so there's something about generosity that has a unique glue quality that holds families together and helps them to thrive. And so it's something I think that's worth everyone, regardless of how much money you have. You don't have to be a Rockefeller to benefit from the same approach to money and to family relationships as well.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. I think that's so fascinating because it does. I think one of the great temptations of wealth is for it to become an idol. I mean, to use biblical language, this is kind of the temptation that we see. Even when Israel is going into the land of milk and honey, there's this warning that God gives of, hey, don't. Also, you might hear the David soundtrack in the background as my kids blast it. That's been playing on repeat for a couple of weeks now. It is a great movie. If you have kids, go see the David movie. Anyways, as I was saying, when Israel was going into the promised land, God has this warning towards them of saying, you're entering this land of milk and honey. Be careful lest you forget that I'm the one who is giving you this wealth.
That's right.
And then there's even this verse that says, that God gives people the power to make wealth. And so seeing wealth as a gift from the Lord is something to steward, of surrendering that to them. I think a lot of folks have been talking about that for a while in the kind of Christian financial advising, kingdom advisor landscape. But I think it's interesting that you marry that with this like picture of practical wisdom, where actually, hey, you have the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts are these two examples of, how wealth, if not unchecked, if not, kind of tempered by this virtue of generosity, can actually wreak havoc in a family. And then you quote this adage that is so powerful, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. I don't know if everyone has heard that before. Can you unpack that? What does that mean? And I'm really curious, unpack what it means for us. And then I'm curious if you think it's true. Have you seen this in kind of your practice of wealth management where G2 and G3, the great wealth transfer is coming, something like $100 trillion passing hands from boomers to subsequent generations? Should we be worried? Probably. But talk to us about the multi-generational approach. Yeah.
And the people inheriting the wealth probably aren't, but should be the most worried. That phrase is common, as it turns out, to cultures around the world throughout history. There are versions or variations of that same expression in China and in the Netherlands and in other places, because there's just something about human nature that there's a success cycle that tends to run such that you have someone who's industrious and hardworking and invents or creates something that generates wealth. That person becomes wealthy in the process. And then there's another generation behind that's given the choice about what to do. How do you steward that resource or those resources in a way, using the other examples, along the lines of the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers? How do you steward those resources in a way that are beneficial to the family, but also to others outside the family? And the pattern, about 90% of the time, according to data, is that by the end of the 3rd generation, wealth failure will happen, meaning that either the relationships will be destroyed or the resources will be dissipated, or both.
Wow.
And research has been done as to why that's the case. And it turns out it's nothing to do with money itself. It's about relationships. And again, being generous in terms of our relationships. So 60% of the time when wealth fails, it fails because of lack of trust and communication inside the family. 25% of the time, it's because the heirs aren't adequately prepared to inherit the resources. They're not properly trained. They're not given the perspective and wisdom early enough in life to take on that responsibility effectively. About 10% of the time, it's because the older generations sort of abdicate their leadership and just kind of take a hands-off approach and don't really plan or care what happens.
Yep.
And a very small amount of the time, the rest of the time, it's because the plans themselves were faulty somehow. So I actually do, when I'm doing advocacy presentations for peers, trying to get them to be more engaged and interested in connecting with clients about giving, I'll cite those statistics and say the good news is we're at fault only about 5% of the time for the wealth failing. The bad news is the wealth still failed.
If your job
90% of the time.
Yeah.
That's right.
If your job is just writing those documents.
That's exactly
that goes
right.
back
if
to
that's all that matters,
yeah.
then congratulations, pat ourselves on the back. We do a pretty good job. It's, the wills are, work, the financial plans make sense, the investments perform, but the vast majority of the time, that's not the problem.
Right.
The problem is the whole thing blows up because of other things, and other things that we can help to nurture and develop as part of building that trust and communication and visibility and transparency. And these are difficult things because I think the number one question that wealthy people ask themselves is, how do I do this? How do I steward these resources and pass them along in a way that's responsible, that's going to be effective, that's going to bless and not curse my children and my grandchildren? Unfortunately, I think my profession often discourages wise behavior in that regard, just because of the assumptions that we make about wealth and what's supposed to happen to it. There's a graph in one of these presentations I'm referencing for peers with a chart that's this upward sloping line. Just goes up and up and up and up and up. And I call it the fallacy of endless upward sloping wealth, which is a mouthful, I'll admit, but I just kind of like the way the words sound. But the idea is, if you look at a typical financial plan put together by me or a colleague or someone else, what it shows is the person getting richer and richer and richer through their life until the illustration ends.
Right.
And it sort of suggests that the implied purpose of money is just to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and then what? And so the point of that slide in the presentation is there are off ramps coming off of that slope that says, when do you start to share money with your loved ones? When do you not wait to pass your inheritance along to your kids when you're dead?
Yeah.
But how do you think about thoughtfully investing in them in ways that are sensible and practical and productive during their lifetimes? Because guess what? They're going to need money more when they're younger than they are when hopefully you're gone. They're old at that point themselves, Lord willing. And their financial life has already been pretty well mapped out at that stage. And so there's just so many times there are these missed opportunities. So we do a lot of work with our clients to encourage them, again, to thoughtfully engage, to thoughtfully invest, and to do that in ways that aren't going to spoil kids. And how much is too much? He certainly is a very secular figure, but I think Warren Buffett's famous quote that he wanted to leave his children enough that they could do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing, is absolutely brilliant, and is a good frame of reference for all of us, particularly us as believers, because that idea of stewardship that you referenced is just, I think, the most important concept around money and really around discipleship in general. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Brian.
Yeah, I would love to even ask a follow-up because, okay, like I hear what you're saying, and I've heard this from some wealth and managers as well, that when kids are younger, adult children are younger, a lump of money can help with a down payment, can help with, whatever, student loan debt, those kinds of things. But that is a piece of the puzzle. I also think I'm interested in what you think about the kind of $100 trillion again in the great wealth transfer, 84 trillion or however you count it, 120 trillion, that's the order of magnitude. A lot of money that gets passed down. And even if you do kind of part of the inheritance early, there's going to be all of these sudden wealth events happening. They're already happening. My wife and I are actually really blessed that we have, a lot of grandparents who are alive. 7 out of our 8 are
Wow.
alive. And in some of those relationships across generations, there's some conversations around estate plans, and in others of those relationships, it's this completely taboo thing where I know that there has been zero conversation at all. And it's not because our grandparents don't have wealth. Actually, really all of them have done quite well for themselves. And so it's just this like weird thing where it's like, I know these sudden wealth events throughout both of our families are coming, and they're going to ripple through. No one thinks about it. No one's ready for it. No one's talking about it. It's what it feels like. And I do think there's a kind of danger there. And so I'm curious about, from a wealth management perspective, this idea of giving wealth, which, we've talked about this. Your profession is disincentivized to do. So only a generous wealth manager will encourage you to give wealth because it actually hurts their own bottom line. But,
although it depends on how it's done. I try to make the argument to colleagues that it's actually in their best interest to have these conversations. One of the great difficulties of our profession is we build a wonderful long-term relationship with clients, and then we struggle to get to know their kids and grandkids.
Yeah,
and when they pass on, that money leaves. And it's not just occasionally, the vast majority of the time that the statistics are consistent throughout firms, throughout the industry. It's that it is the major unspoken fear of wealth managers everywhere built into that great wealth transfer, that their clients are going to pass on, and so are their assets under management.
Yeah.
And so the solution that I offer, which is a simple one, and admittedly will not work in every instance, right? You can't force someone to be generous.
Yeah, that's right.
There's, the Apostle Paul, who's far wiser than me, pointed that out himself. God loves a cheerful giver. But I think anyone who falls inside the circle of people aspiring to be more like Jesus have a natural inclination to want to be generous. And this idea of stewardship will resonate with them in some level. And they'll also be grappling with these questions that we're talking about. How do I love my family in ways that are going to be, I guess, blessings and not burdens? How do I pass along the right money in the right way at the right time? Also acknowledging another often difficult, even forbidden subject, that fare is not always equal. That you may have children that should get different amounts of money, should get different amounts of support and encouragement in different ways at different times because their needs are different. And all of those are things that we try to help clients wrestle with and hopefully thoughtfully address when it comes to making their plans. But for us, and this is the argument I make for my colleagues, the surest way to both help the clients succeed in this wealth trap and to build those deeper, more meaningful relationships, both with the older generations and the younger generations, is to support them in conversations about being generous. If we help them create vehicles for giving and help them engage together as a family in giving, if you look at the common denominator among all the families I know of who succeed, who successfully retain relationships and resources across multiple generations, they're all families who are generous and who have a component of their wealth that's used for supporting churches and ministries and nonprofit organizations doing good in the world. And us as advisors, having an opportunity to engage in those kinds of conversations with clients is incredibly powerful. Not everyone is as well versed at that or comfortable with it as you are, Brian. And so often those advisors are going to need help. They might need a specialist or an expert to come alongside and come in and have that conversation along with them, which would be tremendously productive for everyone involved.
Yeah.
But at that point, one of the side benefits, and where this, believe it or not, I'm not retracing the thread of this part of the conversation, we were getting back to those difficulties around sharing messages about wealth and communicating about wealth, and the fact that some people are just reluctant to do that. If you start to introduce in essence, conversations about money and meaning through generosity,
Hmm.
you're bringing people into topics about value and about vision and about what money's for in a way that from a pretty young age, you can start to acclimate them into the fact that, wow, we have money. You can start to deliver a message that we have surplus resources that we can share with others. And that starts to reinforce both the proper perspective on money and also the fact that there's money around here in this family ecosystem that we're all responsible for. And it helps to train the kids from an early age to be involved in those conversations in appropriate ways. And you're setting the stage for them to be able to come more readily into other conversations about money
Yeah.
as they get older and when it's appropriate. So all of that, again, just reinforces healthy family dynamics and good stewardship.
Yeah. I want to push back against something. Maybe not push back. Maybe that's too strong of a word. But I want to push on something in a more radical direction. And I'm curious what you're going to think about this. So I have heard people make this kind of, for financial advisors, what I would say is like this, a version of like a self-interested argument towards talking about generosity. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think I understand, if what you're saying, and I've heard this before, is you have these conversations around generosity, you're going to get a lot deeper with clients than you do in other, in our process with philanthropic advising, we just talk about giving, but we start with life stories and people share all sorts of things. And then the emotional connection that gets built is really strong. You can, even structurally through a family foundation or through donor advised funds, turn that into a multi-generational connection with the family, helping them think through these things. And there's this kind of business case. At the same time, I kind of love the idea of wealth managers who lose money, who lose money on helping people give. And it's not a self-interest kind of thing, but I actually think human beings are amazingly pro-social. So, or they're capable of it. Human beings are capable of amazing selfishness and amazing service. They're both possibilities. And I think those are possibilities inside all of us. And we can kind of feed one or the other. And but one of the things that's really interesting on the research on giving is that 97% of affluent donors, when asked, why do you give? They say, to make a difference. 97%. It's the highest motivation reported. The second highest motivation, 94%, is because they believe in a mission. And at the very least, they think that is why they're doing what they're doing. I'm willing. I am the kind of person who trusts that. I see in myself a set of selfish motivations and a set of pro-social motivations, and I want to live out those more and more to cultivate this own generous virtue. So I guess I'm really interested in, Chris, like, is there a case for financial advisors and wealth managers who come alongside people within these deepest, or have some of the deepest relationships with them in regards to their money, to those people themselves to become the kind of people that just want to see broken things be healed in the world, that the counsel is set up that private foundation, but consider a sunset clause. And we're going to actually watch this wealth die. And I'm going to lose money and you're going to lose all that wealth. But guess what? Some amazing things are going to happen in the world. And, I think about Bill Gates. I think about Bill Gates. The Gates Foundation is the most famous example of this right now. 20 years from now, the Gates Foundation will not exist. And what's so interesting in Gates's letter about why he's sunsetting the foundation, he actually quotes Jesus. He actually says, he said, "My mom taught me that to whom much is given, much will be required." Which is just, he doesn't give Jesus the credit there, but Jesus said that. Jesus, and his mom was a believer, and and so he's giving away, $40 billion.
Easy to source.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I'm curious about, is there a place to make that radical argument with people in the wealth of like, hey, maybe as a financial advisor, maybe you've passed your own financial finish line, and have come to this place of enough, and that is another reason to encourage people to give is just to change the world.
I love that thought process. I
Push
think you're
back if I'm
absolutely
wrong.
correct.
I
No. So I think you can think about this in the same way you can think about faith in general. And you might categorize faith in two dimensions: superficial and transformational. A superficial faith believes that Jesus is the Son of God, goes to church on Sunday, uh, tries to be a good person, and basically goes around the business of walking a journey of faith, professes Christ as their savior, but it's not absolutely immersed and saturated into every part of their being.
Yeah.
It's sort of a part of their identity in the same way that having a certain hair color or having gone to a certain school is a part of their identity. And that's good. And that's probably the majority of practicing Christians in the world. And that connection to Christ has been a benefit and a blessing in their life and in the life of the world as a whole.
Right.
But the people who are transformed by their relationship with Christ, and I'm an aspiring transformed disciple, are the people who we read about in the Bible, the people that are completely changed in ways that are radically upside down for every value that the world holds dear.
Right.
And it's that radical call to discipleship that I think that we all struggle with. There's like a moment of clarity when you realize, wow, there's a lot more to this than I realized, which was part of where I was in that early missionary for generosity phase. I was like, I know there's something more here, and I kind of feel like I'm going through the motions. And so what is it exactly, God? And the Lord's been very kind, very gracious in sort of helping me discover this path that was leading me more deeply into these waters, so to speak. So where does that lead in terms of your observation? I think you're exactly right. So I'm trying to reach with that message of it's actually good for you to give or to be involved in conversations about giving to folks that are just putting their toe in the water and saying, well, gosh, that does sound like it might be in my best interest. Because it's once you're in the door and you kind of have that experience and start to get involved, hopefully that builds in the same way that many people's faith journey has sort of a slow build over time. But I aspire to, and I know a number of other colleagues and people I admire and respect who have already gotten to this point where they are fully self-sacrificial, all in on radically doing with and for their clients what Jesus calls us to do.
Right.
And that is a totally different mindset than the kind of, well, yeah, look, you could give some money away and it's good for you and good for other people. And that more radical mindset really is completely selfless. And once you get to that point, I think you really couldn't care less, what's in it for you. And I'll give you a real world example of how that tension plays out. As a practical matter, so I work with individuals and families. And someone asked me what I do for a living. I say, I run a wealth management practice that's focused on giving. And people are always like, that's unusual. What do you mean? I say, well, we work with individuals and families who prioritize generosity. That's the private client side of our practice. And then on the institutional side, we work with churches, ministries, and nonprofit organizations, helping them be good stewards of resources and also raise more money. And that's a hook that always gets people in. It's like, whoa, I give you more money. So there's that's kind of the sales pitch. But when you actually get into the weeds on having those conversations with families or with institutions, you end up in that same territory, which is the how much is enough question. What's the right amount for me? What's the right amount for my loved ones? What is supposed to be going to the kingdom? And there's an inherent tension in some of that. For instance, in the institutional asset management space, if you're a faith-oriented ministry that's called to alleviate pain and suffering in the world now, how much money should you have in the bank?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you've got to have some amount of money because it would be unwise. It would be foolish to not have a margin of safety, not have some resources for a rainy day. not have some money that would be there in case there's a bump that would cause disruption to your programs, which would harm the people you're trying to help. On the
Exactly.
other hand, if you just stockpile money, uh, you reach a point at which, why aren't you using it to help people now? Why, you don't know what tomorrow, right? The parable of the barns. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. There comes a point at which those chips should be on the table, and you shouldn't just be kind of harvesting them and keeping them aside for purposes that, whether they're acknowledged or unacknowledged, end up being kind of institutionally driven rather than kingdom driven.
Yeah.
And so these are inherent tensions. And so it's a very subversive question that you asked. And I don't often talk about my interest in being one of the people that helps others get to that point of just putting all
Breaking
the chips
the
on
rules.
the table. Yeah, breaking the rules, because
Yeah.
that's not how the world teaches people to operate, right? The world
That's
is the upward slope, is the endlessly upward sloping line. And we're, I think, called to do something more radical and more immediate in our stewardship.
Yeah.
And how that looks for each person and each organization is different, but those are the right questions to be asking.
Yeah. I think there's an important tension here. And I do think that sometimes, even in the kind of Christian community, we get a little bit tripped up in our professional lives with thinking about, the virtues of self-interest. I have this degree in economics from Duke, and so I think about this a lot, and kind of the Econ 101, you learn about, hey, look, free markets are amazing. If everyone is acting in their own self-interest, then resources are efficiently allocated and everyone is best off. Actually, human flourishing can happen just by everyone acting in their own self-interest. And I do think that that's a true model, and that's not always true. There are cases where the model breaks in the real world, but there's something amazing about what's possible when people are wise and acting within their own self-interest, and the way the world can come together. But I also think that I don't know, Adam Smith wrote a book about morals. The founding fathers talked about morals all the time. And there was this acknowledgement that, yes, something really remarkable can happen just on the basis of free markets and democracy and self-interest. But also, everything is going to kind of start breaking down if we don't have moral virtue. And I think generosity is one of those moral virtues that actually binds together civil society, even binds together markets, creates trust, creates social cohesion, creates social capital. If we're able to actually see each other as people worthy of dignity and respect and honor, and then act in such a way where we are, respecting that inherent dignity and honor, and even blessing each other unprompted, like that actually is key for the whole thing to work, and arguably is why we see so much kind of breaking down in our society right now. It's not because we need, I think, more and more free markets, or more and more democracy. Like, those systems are roughly there. We can talk about that. but I think we lose so much in our modern world is just morality and these basic virtues of, there's 7 classical virtues, the 3 theological ones, faith, hope, and love, and the 4 cardinal ones, prudence, justice, temperance, and help me out here if you remember it. Courage. Yes, how can I forget courage? Aristotle says it was most important. It's actually, that's the stuff we need a lot more of. And I think that's actually, I got you. I went all philosophical on you here, Chris, but I
like it, Brian.
I had a feeling you would like it, but I almost feel like we need that radical argument of even in the wealth management space, I think, there's a group I like called Praxis, and, they have this framework of, attack the exploitative, try not to do anything exploitative in your professional life, baseline the ethical, And I think that's what we're talking about here is it's ethical and good to help people think about generosity, to build a healthy, successful wealth management across generations, but then the third one is chase after the redemptive. And I think to have kind of both of these pieces of it is wise to talk about generosity and in a financial planning practice, and it is good and beautiful to encourage even a kind of radical generosity where you will lose money, and to actually lower your assets under management because so much of it is going to incredible causes.
I would love to echo what you've been sharing, because I think you are 100% correct. And even the references you're using are ones that really resonate strongly with me, because I've thought a lot about the same sort of fundamental sources of wisdom that we have in our society and how we're drifting away from those in important ways. For instance, you talked about the founders. There's a great book by the philosopher Michael Novak called On Two Wings about the founding of America, which was a deliberate effort to bring together faith and reason. And the founders believed there's a lot of, I think, misinformation out there about the theology of the founders. Some were definitely less traditional in their Christian practice than others, but all fundamentally believed that if you didn't have morality, if you didn't have a God and absolute standards, then you couldn't keep a democracy together. It wasn't possible. If you didn't have that common framework of understanding about what was good and what wasn't good, and what was evil and what wasn't evil, that people would naturally fall into their own self-interest, and the effort would break apart, which I think is a lot of what accounts for the tension that we're seeing in our society now in terms of political and economic dimensions.
Yeah.
Adam Smith, one of my favorites, as you know, Wealth of Nations is what he's famous for. But his first volume, the slimmer and I think more powerful Theory of Moral Sentiments, was all about money and morality, because he was a professor of moral philosophy. That was
Right.
his job. And he developed economics as a way of understanding how people behaved in the economy that he observed, and moreover, how they should behave. And there was an underlying element of generosity in all of that he saw in human nature, and he thought was essential in order for an economy to work. So I'm going to double down on your radical and subversive statements. And I've given this a lot of thought lately and have not shared this in public with anyone. So I'm a little nervous. I think if we actually read Scripture in the way that it was intended, in the way that Christ taught, and if we were trying to align that with a socioeconomic worldview that was a coherent philosophy, and that adopted some of the other existing frameworks that are out there as part of our philosophical understanding of the economy and how the world works, the two competing sort of worldviews in that regard, as you know, are capitalism and socialism in one form or fashion.
Right.
And I think that if you read Scripture, that God is both a capitalist and a socialist. And in fact, a Christian approach to money and the economy could fairly be characterized as sacrificial capitalism.
Yep.
And voluntary socialism. If you blended those two things together, I think that gets you about as close as you can get. So yes, free markets. Yes, create wealth. Yes, the God is a God of abundance, and he wants us to be productive. He wants us to use all the tools and resources we can at our disposal, ethically, morally, in a Christ-centered way, to create more, because he is a God who created everything. And at the same time, our responsibility, once we do that, is to share it with those who need it.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
just to build bigger barns and put it away for ourselves. And I see a lot of similar thinking out in the world. I haven't heard anyone express it quite that way, but there's a lot of movements I think that you're part of and I'm part of, Bias. And I think we're rippling out into our audience, people who have that sense and also recognize that is an antidote for the path that we're on at this point. Which is one in which our society implodes because of self-centeredness on the part of the capitalists,
Yeah.
and because of I don't know the right word to be, so like hubris on the part of the socialists.
That's right.
who kind of want to take everything over, and both of those wings are needed, like the original idea of faith and reason. You need both of those things together in order for the system to function in as much of a kingdom sense as it could be.
Yeah.
But when we read in scripture, the kingdom of heaven is like, I think the kingdom of heaven is like that.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for any of us to get our arms around that. And it's uncomfortable at times. And it certainly is sacrificial at times. But I think, generosity to me is a proxy for a lot of values that underline that mindset, that a lot of believers are working their way towards in one form or fashion, because they're feeling that same call in their hearts, particularly ones that have been richly blessed with material success and are trying to cope with, in all the ways that we've described, how do I be a responsible steward of that? How do I honor God and serve Christ with that success? And I think it looks something like that. So there's a bomb for you in the
I love it, Chris. I love it. I love it. This is a podcast about learning to love generously like Jesus. And those words sound hopefully very palatable to our audience of people, church-going Christians. It's basically our audience. And it's like, okay, of course, we're going to love generously like Jesus. Like, that's something we should aspire to do. And at the same time, gosh, how radical oh my gosh, what's it called? The golden rule. The golden rule.
The golden rule.
How radical is the golden rule? How you want to be treated. Think about that, and then find other people and treat them like that.
Love your neighbors yourself. And
yes.
I'd even go one step farther than that, Brian. So there's a framework, again, that's deliberate. All of the frameworks that are offered in Wise Generosity are meant to be provocative, but in a very engaging, positive way. People to say, I hadn't thought about it that way. And some of them are borrowed from other sources. So there's actually a framework that came from Buddhism. Generosity is a fundamental tenet of Buddhism. And again, it's in that kind of sense of enlightenment, to unburdening yourselves of things and sharing them with others. But Buddha talked about 3 different types of giving: miserly giving, kindly giving, and kingly giving. And I repurpose those in Wise Generosity to be tin giving, golden giving, and diamond giving. So the tin giving is giving away stuff that you don't want anyway. It's like yard sale giving, right? You've got a bunch of stuff. You're going to put it out on the curb. If someone comes and takes it, great. You get nothing out of that, really, except maybe the satisfaction of cleaning up your clutter. Someone else, you may find a treasure in that they value deeply. But again, it's not an optimal episode of generosity. Golden generosity, golden rule: do unto others. You see someone who lacks something that you have, and there's just part of you. And Adam Smith actually talks about this in Theory of Moral Sentiments. He said there's something about human beings that get pleasure in helping other people. And I think we are all wired that way because we're made in God's image and because God is generous. And that's, I think, I say this often, I think generosity is the aspect of God that's closest to the surface in our human nature. And so all of that's kind of caught up in this. You need something, I have it, I want to share it. But the diamond giving is the agape giving. That's the self-sacrificial giving. That's the, I have something that I want. I'm going to give it to you and deprive myself of it in the process, because it's not just reciprocal. It's going beyond that, which of course is the love of Christ, right? The King of the universe came to earth and emptied himself, as Paul writes, of all of that authority and power to be a humble baby and then grow up in a vulnerable world, living a very difficult life. And ultimately sacrificing himself for the sake of the world. That is an incredible act of generosity, of course. That's and marveling at that, and then trying to get our heads around how we emulate that, I think is a big part of what that transformational faith is like. So we're swimming in some pretty deep waters at this point, but this is great.
I appreciate your willingness to paddle out here with me, Chris, out. And I was hoping we would. I know you're a deep thinker. Like I said, your book Wise Generosity is filled with just rigorous thoughts, engaging stories, but also these wonderful frameworks. We didn't even really get into like what you mean by wise generosity, of generosity that's well-grounded, inspired, satisfying, and effective. Gosh, we could go so deep into each of those words. And you talk about, I loved also in your book, you talked about kind of the 5 P's of where to give, with proximity, proportion, production, power, and the present. So I am not actually going to ask you to unpack those things. That's just going to be the teaser. If you're listening to this conversation, go buy the book. It's called Wise Generosity. You can find it where books are sold.
Where books are sold. Yeah, in fact, we just recorded the audio book and released it just before Christmas.
Oh, wonderful.
My joke has been Morgan Freeman was unavailable, so I read it myself. Sorry for everyone in the audience. If you're already sick of hearing me talk, you might just want the regular book. You'll read it the old-fashioned way. But if you prefer to listen to your content, then that option is available as well.
Awesome. Well, Chris, as we're wrapping up today, what is one way that you're learning in this season of life what it means to love generously like Jesus? And feel free to circle back to things we've already discussed. Obviously, we've gotten into some deep waters, but I'm curious just to learn from you and what you're learning.
There's this framework that I have that keeps coming up in my mind at this point as I'm reflecting on and aspiring to, be who Jesus called me to be. I've got a coach and a counselor, a good friend, who frames our lives in terms of our perfect identity. We have a perfect God-given identity. There's a version of us that God made that is spotless and without blemish, and that's not the version that walks around every day. And gets to do podcasts with you. But in essence, one way of thinking about our journey of faith is to become more like that version of God. And what Christ enables us to do is to have God see us that way, stripped away of all the stuff that we've done to mess that up, all of which is beautiful to think about. For me, it's how do I be obedient? Because faith leads to trust, leads to obedience, and obedience ultimately produces provision. And that relationship in a season of launching a new venture and having new things to worry about and existing responsibilities. And, as I said at the beginning, being in that sandwich era right now with kids who are finding their way in the world as young adults and parents who need extra help and support. There's a lot going on in my life, and I'm sure in the lives of many of our listeners. Life is challenging and complicated at times. And so being faithful and having this sense of trust in what God is doing, and just being grateful for the fact that, he has made us, when we hear the call that he has for us, and he blesses us, not necessarily with material blessings, but with just that sense of peace that comes with being aligned with his purposes. And so that's really where I'm most focused right now, is finding that peace, the shalom, right? Not just the absence of conflict, but the wholeness and completeness, the perfect rightness of being aligned with God's kingdom and God's purposes. That's the peace that Christ promised. Amid all the storms of everything else, that's what I'm seeking most in this season. And so thank you, Brian, for an opportunity to come. I admire and appreciate you and your work very much, and certainly have enjoyed this conversation. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The invitation to grow this week is to do a small act of generosity, whether with your money, attention, or energy, or possessions. Be creative and notice how generosity affects your life and your relationships. Thank you so much to Chris Gabriel for joining me on the show. If you have feedback on this episode, you can reach me at brian@simplecharity.org. Next time on the show, a conversation with a businessman who now works in Christian higher education. I hope you join me as we continue to learn to love generously like Jesus. Have a great week. I'll see you next time.